some of the kids used to be making fun of my skin color. The enemy used to attack me with suicidal thought. That opened up all kinds of abuse. My kids were taken into the foster care system, and I really felt the love of Jesus through her. My name's Rose. My birth name is Camellia Rose, but most people just call me Rose. And I was born in Toronto, Canada. My family, my dad's from Jamaica and my mother's from the West Indies, Trinidad. And I was born in Canada. And so I spent my whole childhood there. I had a lot of aunts and cousins in Toronto. And from the time I was a little baby, my parents basically raised me in the church. The first person who ever preached the gospel to me was actually my grandfather, Harold Jackman, who was a pastor. And he's the one that really lit the fire in me and just inspired me. And growing up, I was really, really shy. But I remember that I really loved hearing the Bible stories. And in the Sunday school, my aunt would always put me to read the little Bible stories to the church when I was 7. And I think I always had a sense that God was there. I always felt his presence. I used to get a lot of dreams when I was little. But when I was around 7 years old, my parents took me to the Bible study, and I was the only child there. And I remember sitting by the window of the Bible study, and even though I was little, I heard the adults talking about Jesus coming back and his plan of salvation. And I remember I was listening, and I just thought, I felt suddenly this sense that, Jesus is real, he's coming back. And I looked through the window and I could see the sky outside, and I was just so amazed by the creation. And it really spoke to me in my spirit. And so that night by the window, I just told Jesus, I'm like, I believe in you, I want to follow you. And it was just a really simple prayer as a child, but to me it meant everything. And a few weeks later, my mom came and was telling me about giving my life to Jesus, and I told her I was ready. And so at 7, my mom prayed with me, and that was essentially the first start of just surrendering my life to Christ. My journey was not easy. I went through many difficult circumstances in my life. Where I grew up in a school where there was only maybe 4 other Black kids there, of which I was one. And I remember some of the kids used to be making fun of my skin color. They'd be calling me chocolate milk. They'd be making just comments. And I felt really, some made comments about my hair, and I felt really insecure in my skin. And I thought it kind of made me feel like an outsider. And so I had a lot of insecurity about who I was culturally, where do I align myself. And I remember there was some other Black kids there, and because I had interest in things like classical music, which wasn't considered maybe traditionally part of my culture, I always felt like I was never fitting into one side or the other. But it was during that time that the Lord began to teach me about writing and art and music, and I always liked creativity, so I always expressed myself that way. And that was how I found my voice. And so that was basically my childhood. When I was 14, my family moved to Quebec. And it was a really interesting experience just getting used to a whole new province. I had to make new friends here. I remember at my school, I was really isolated. I didn't have any friends. So I used to be going to the library to write. And God began to develop those skills in me, and I found the more that I would write, I would actually hear his voice clearly. And so it shows that God, he speaks to everyone in different ways. The way he talks to you might look maybe different, but it's not weird. It's just that he created all of us unique with certain gifts and talents. And if you really let the Holy Spirit minister to you, he can definitely use you. For me, the real journey was discovering my identity in Jesus, because although I gave my life to the Lord at 7, I always had this impression that God was always mad at me, and I felt like I wasn't worthy to live up to his standard. And so I put so much pressure on myself trying to do trying to be perfect. And the thing is, I didn't understand that it's not through us, it's only Jesus that renews us to become more and more like him, that we can't do it on our own. So walking that out was such a process. I went through long periods of depression. I really struggled with my mental health for a long time. The enemy used to attack me with suicidal thoughts. I had many times where I was just like, I don't understand, God, if you have a plan for my life. And I really struggled with that. And because of that insecurity, that led me to get into relationships with people, with men specifically, that didn't have the same love of Jesus, so they couldn't really treat me the way I deserved to be treated. And because of that, that opened up all kinds of abuse in my life. And that led me to feel really insecure. I felt like I didn't know who I was. Suddenly, the voice that they would say negative things became the voice in my head that I would hear. And I think like a lot of young women, like we think that we're gonna find love in all these different places, but really it's only the love of Jesus that can really fill you up. And if you're really struggling with that, like I encourage you, like just seek after the Lord. When the time is right, God will actually bring the right person, but if you go ahead of God's timing, it just doesn't work. So you want God to order your footsteps. So at 22, I got pregnant with my first child, and that relationship didn't last. But the experience of becoming a mom was it was difficult. I remember when I brought my baby home from the hospital, I actually cried that first night because I was like, God, I don't know what I'm doing. And I felt really scared, and I was like, kept doubting myself, and the Lord was like, I'm gonna be with you through this. Like, I gave you this child for a reason. And I remember when I was pregnant that there was a nurse that was like, well, maybe you could just terminate the pregnancy. And I told her, no, I wanna keep this child. And I did, and what happened is the Lord really showed me through my daughter what it meant to have sacrificial love, because suddenly there was like a little child that depended on me that I got to show love to. And it really showed me that, you know, with kids, like they may do something wrong and we may get upset, but like you still love them. Like you would never, you know, turn them aside. And the Lord showed me through my daughter that that is how he feels about me. And so it was a hard experience, but it was a really necessary one. And through that dynamic, I really got to understand like the love of the Father. After that, I went through other circumstances. I'm a mom to 3 kids, and it was in 2020, my kids were taken into the foster care system in Montreal. And I noticed that sometimes there's a perception with foster care that the parent must be a bad parent or whatever perception people have, because they don't understand that sometimes people go through things, it's not necessarily their fault, but you know, that's life. And the last 3 years, that has been part of my journey. I've watched my kids go through a lot of suffering because of that experience. There has been some really hard days where I've cried about them, and I wish I could say that that circumstance is over, but it's something that I'm currently walking through now. But earlier in 2020, when I was feeling really down and I was missing my kids, I went to a church called the Lazarus Outreach. And it's funny because in the Bible, Lazarus was somebody who was lying in the grave when the Lord called him forth and brought him to life. And walking into the Lazarus, I was so broken, but there was a lady in there called Leslie Kaza. And that lady, when she saw me, she was a counselor, so she called me into her office. And she asked me just to tell her a bit of my story. And I shared what was happening with my kids, with my family. And the first thing she said to me, she's like, "I believe you." And I think sometimes just going through a situation, just having somebody say like, "I see you, I hear you, I care about you," that is all anybody wants to hear. And for me, it brought back like a sense of healing. And I remember right there in her office, she held me, she hugged me, and I really felt the love of Jesus through her. And after that, we became super close. She almost became like a second mom to me, and the person that would pray with me on the phone for hours. And the Lord really showed up through that connection. And that was just showing me that the hands of God are often through the hands and feet of our own brothers and sisters. That if you're asking God to do something in your life, you may feel like, I want to come away from the church, maybe the church hurt you, but I'm telling you that anything that you expect God to do in your life, he often does it by sending a destiny helper along your path to speak into your life, to bless you. And so when we're willing to open up our hearts to other and be surrender and just be vulnerable and share our stories, that is when God can come in and bring the healing. I just want to encourage you that if you're struggling in your faith walk with God, you're feeling angry with the Lord, just know that he hasn't forgotten about you. He hasn't forsaken you, that there is nowhere else you can go but to the cross. And Jesus, his arms are always ready to embrace you. And this journey of sanctification, it's a lifelong journey until Jesus comes back. We will never be perfect, but through our weaknesses, he promises to show himself strong and mighty. So I just want to encourage you to lean on the Lord, trust in him with all your heart, no matter what you've gone through. Don't be afraid or don't be afraid of the things that you've gone through or even ashamed of your story. We all have them. But at the end of the day, the Lord is going to get the testimony and the glory through the things that you've experienced. So God bless you.